Hey fun friends, today I am going to walk through how to build a pretty simple Shiny app using the Shiny package in RStudio. I'm just going to clear my little environment here for you. So a couple of things that I want to explain before I get started. Well, in typical fashion, with my code, the first things that I'm going to do are load the necessary packages that I need and call my data and save it to an object. So I'm doing that right here. I have all of these 3 packages already installed on my computer, and so they're available to me as long as I kind of load them, and I use this function library to do that. So I am loading the Shiny package read Excel in order to read this data or import the data into my environment, and I'm going to build a plot with ggplot. So to load my data, I'm going to create this object sp bottom/data. This is just a memory tool for me. It means scatter plot data, and I'm going to use this object later. I use the read Excel function, and this is right here is a location on my computer. As you can see way over here, the data file is actually called data2. All of this gets saved into a data object, as I said, sp bottom/data. So those I'm going to do first. I'm not going to run them first. I'm going to run the whole app at one time. So I just want to navigate the code in this app just briefly. A Shiny app differs a little bit from code that I am used to working with because it has distinct pieces that need to happen. Specifically, it has 3 parts for an app. Now, Shiny, you can create an app that has 2 different files, being the user interface and the server in 2 separate files. But the more the updated R you're able to do these in 1 file. So as you can see, this app is titled app.r, even though in the folder it's saved as dashboard. So this file contains 3 parts. It contains this UI, which is an object that is being created. Oops, I don't know what I just did there. Let me undo it. That is being created, and all of these lines of code are being pushed into this object UI. UI is how I'm going to define the user interface for the application whose purpose it is to build a chart. Now I'm going to come back to it though. I'm just going to come over to the second part of a Shiny app, which is the server. And so the server object is built an object, and it contains all of these lines of what will be in the output. And then the third part of a Shiny app is this Shiny app function that runs the application. And here you see that the argument UI is going to be equal to the UI object that I built. And then the second argument of the Shiny app function is the server argument, and the server will be the server object that I built. So this creates the app from the 2 objects that I'm going to define up here. And then, great, so those are the 3 main parts of a Shiny app. And so now let me go through them one by one. Starting with the user interface. And the user interface can be considered the part of the app that the user interacts with, and it may contain push buttons or drop-down menus or text boxes that the user can use. Will all be on the user interface, as well as any kind of charts or tables or visualizations will also be there. So in order to define my my user interface, I have to think about it as being a visual representation of what I want my application to look like. It consists of, just like you could turn a page or a web page into sections or components, with a user interface page, you can add a title section or different panels, side panels on each side, a main kind of panel in the middle, or a main page, or you could even have multiple layers of pages and they would resemble something like tabs. So for the purposes of this panel, like my purpose is to create a scatter plot with a regression line that has a place to enter a title and a drop-down menu to enter a smoothing method. So I'm going to start with the fluid page. Fluid page creates an object in the user interface that controls the layout and appearance, and the user interface controls the layout and appearance, but the fluid page auto adjusts to whatever size the user's browser window is open to or computer window is open to. Then within that fluid page, I'm going to create, kind of lay out my app. So I'm going to use a main panel instead of a side panel because I want my selector, my smoothing method drop-down menu and the slider input to be on top of the scatter plot. So in order to do that, I'm going to just use a main panel, and the other option there would be, like, you could use a side panel that in all the information that I'm getting ready to build would show up on one side. But I want it on top, so I'm just going to use a main panel. And then within that panel, see, I have these open parentheses. So within that panel, I'm going to create an object. First, I want the select input object. And this has, here I'm using 4 arguments of it. The input ID is called the smooth method. And the equal sign, it indicates that what is on the right side of the equal sign is the value that I want for the left of the equal sign. So here the input ID is smooth method, and it is necessary for it to be in with that, like half quote apostrophe on each side. And then each line of the argument is going to be followed by a comma, as well as a comma between each object in my main panel. So the input ID will be smooth method. The label that I want for this input will be titled. See, now I have the double quotes, quotation marks, for choose your method of fit line smoothing, and it's actually going to say this. Then I'm going to have choices, and in my choices I'm going to use the list argument, and all the list items I will be contained within parentheses, and here I'm using 3 list items. The first one will be called none, and so this is a little bit particular, but none will be called none. Then linear model will equal, or will be, LM will be the linear model, or LM, and LOS will be the LOS smoothing method. So the types of smoothing methods will be selected from a drop-down list containing none, LM, or LOS. By default, this is what this argument is about. The one that will be selected by default will be none here. And that's what's going to be selected by default. So by default, when you run this app, no smoothing method will be selected. Then I'm going to move on to creating the next input kind of item that or object that I want in my user interface. So I'm going to separate this object, the select input, with a comma from the conditional panel. So this object creates an item or an object that is conditional. This object creates an object. Well, this object argument function creates specifically a slider, and I know it's a slider because I'm using the slider input, but it's a conditional panel. So the condition meaning it's contingent on what the input is. And so one interesting thing about Shiny kind of syntax is that it's a little bit different from regular R syntax. And here, this input method is talking about this select input method. So if this dot right here means that if the input is the input of smooth method, so if the input ID is smooth method, if this input from the smooth method select input is equal to Loge, and that's why we have two equal signs. If this is an argument operationally, if it is absolutely equal to Loge, then the condition will be, it'll show a slider input, and the input ID is called span. So the ID of the slider input is called span. The label will be set to the amount of smoothing, and then this slider bar will have a minimum value of 0.3, a maximum value of 0.9. It'll be set by default to 0.3, and then they will run in 0.05 steps or increments across the input bar. Okay. Now all of these arguments are contained within the slider input, which are contained in this conditional panel. I just wanted that to be clear. And then I'm going to work on my next object. So I'm going to follow that with a comma. Now I have another input, which is a text input. So this creates an object. Basically, this is a text box that you can that the user can write something in. The ID, or what I'm calling this, it will be title text. And these are important because I'll be using these later. The label will be called enter a title, and then the value, by default, it'll automatically say your title here. I'm going to follow that text input object, and now I need to create an output object. So all of these objects, I just want to be clear, are contained within the user interface all on one page, and it's the select input drop-down menu here, then the conditional panel that appears when LOS is selected, then a text box that says enter your title, whose value is already your title here, and then a plot output. So this is the actual scatter plot. It'll be called scatter, or the object. Its output ID will be called scatter. The width at 900 pixels, and the height at 400 pixels. Each of the arguments within both of these objects are separated with a comma. Then here, this parentheses is closing the main panel object, and then the last parentheses is closing the fluid page object. And all of these lines of code will be saved into this UI object. So this defines the user interface. Now I need to work on my server function, or my server. And so the server defines all of the logic that is required to draw a plot in this instance. Now, the server of a different app is going to define everything that is required to do whatever that app is intended to do. Here, we're drawing a plot. So it builds an output object that contains all the instructions. So function, we have the input and the output, and all of this gets saved. This function, input and output, gets saved to the server object. So here I have an open brackets, and you see another one here. The open brackets, they call them braces, and they group operations within the lines of text. They're also important in a Shiny app because they help with reactive objects. And what I mean by reactive is that what that means is that depending on what the input is, the output changes. So we have the labels for the select input and the slider. As the user changes those, they will recalculate. And so those are very important for the Shiny app. So the first part of my server logic, or my server, is going to be defining the output. And this is where I use my input items, or the items in my user interface. Here I'm calling the scatter, which was the plot output. So I'm saying that the output is this scatter. And we use the $sign in here to kind of put this object together. You also see this $sign when you are calling a variable from a data set, but here it's specifically referring to an object. And that's this object that I defined right here in my user interface. So these next lines of code are all getting pushed into this output object. And what the function that I'm using is renderPlot. RenderPlot creates a plot, or whatever I tell it to do, whatever I outline in these next items. And the render function is important in Shiny apps because that's how it takes the inputs and the outputs, kind of puts them together. So here we see parentheses and a braces together. So it's going to run all of these lines of code as an operation. And then I'm just doing something that is really familiar to me, which is just creating a ggplot using my ggplot2 package. The first argument is calling my data, which is the scatterplot data, and then I need to call my aesthetics. So the aesthetics are kind of what the plot is going to look like, and here I'm defining my x variable as performance rating, and my y variable it's called assessment, which is the score on the assessment, on a training assessment. Then I'm going to go ahead and close the aesthetics and the ggplot object or function here, and go in with my plus signs. So these plus signs indicate that I'm going to add layers to my ggplot. So the first layer that I'm going to use is the geom bottom/point. This indicates the size of the point that I want on my plot. Then I have, and I'm still using the plus sign to add more layers. Then I'm going to use the y limiter, and so this will define the upper and lower limits of the y-axis. There's also an xlim argument that I'm not using, and so the lower limit will be 75 and the upper limit will be 265. Then I'm going to move on to my next layer, which is the title, and here I have another reactive element that's indicated by this $sign. So the input is going to be title text, which is this object that I created up here in the UI. So whatever gets typed into the text box that I call title text will get put right here. It will pull this title object from the UI. So the GG title, input title text. Then, so that's the title. Then I'm using StatSmooth, which is a smoothing method that is used usually for regressions. It may be used for some other things, but this adds a smoothing line to my plot. The method that I'm using is indeed reactive, so the method that I'm calling this input, this refers back to this input smooth method. Whatever it equals up here will depend on what the smoothing line is. So input smooth method, the default level of confidence here is 95, but for this particular plot I'm using 0.80% confidence interval. And then the span, here we go again with another reactive item, is the input span. So the input span ID is here. This is this conditional panel. And so this StatSmooth line will show up depending on the input of the span object in the user interface, and will automatically remove empty, non-existent variables. Like if there are any missing data, it'll remove that. And then I have one more layer, which is going to be the theme. And the theme function or of a layer allows me to edit the elements of a plot. And specifically what I want to do here is that I want to edit the size of the text, the axis text. So like the X and the Y points, they're called element tags. Those are going to be size 5. And then the axis titles, I'm changing to size 10. And then the plot title, I'm changing to size 20. And the plot title has a couple more arguments here. I'm using bold, and this horizontal adjust set to 1 means it'll be right justified. All of that gets saved inside the theme function that gets shut up in this big ggplot function. Then we close the output scatter or the render plot function. Everything in render plot gets saved to the output, and then here is the last reactive bracket. So then all of this gets pushed into the server. So now I've defined my server. Then lastly, I'm just going to call the Shiny app, and I do that through the function Shiny app. And it takes two, well actually it can take 3 arguments, but here I'm using 2. The UI argument is equal to the UI I defined here in the beginning. The server argument is equal to the server that I have defined here. And then there's another argument that you can use called session, but I'm not using that here. And so once all of this is saved, then I'm just going to click Run App. And here is the Shiny app. So here in the user interface is everything that I defined in the UI, in the fluid page. Choose your method of smoothing. So here are the 3 choices that I had, and the none, LM, and the Loesch. Notice that these are capitalized, and these were used here. You see, like, you choose the first. I could have written this and called it anything, like choice 1, choice 2, choice 3. And then the second part of the argument is the value that is used in or or that the regression actually uses of the linear model of the none, the LM, and the low. So the type, which is selected none. Then I can enter a title here. We saw this in the text input. Enter a title and your title here. Enter a title, your title here. This is the Loesch smoothing, just so you can see how it changes. And then the reactive part is when you choose the LM, then we get this smoothing line here. And when you choose Loesch, then here comes the conditional panel that was added to set at 0.03 to 0.09. And as you move it, it changes the smoothing line from not very smooth at all to 0.09, very smooth. And you see that I had adjusted these, the size of the text for the graph marks, the indicators on the X and Y axis, and the title, the size of those. Loesch smoothing, and this title is right aligned, right justified. That's how it works. Great, very good.